my name's Callie Blackwell and I'm the author of a book, The Boy in 7 Billion, out on April the 6th. And you can follow me on Twitter at Darren's mum. Okay, so Darren was diagnosed when he was 10 years old with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. He went through the first 18 months of treatment fairly well. There was a few issues, but nothing life-threatening at the time. And then 18 months later, he was diagnosed with a second cancer, a much rarer one called Langerhans cell sarcoma. And this meant that he was the only person in the entire world to have the two cancers together. There was no prognosis, really. They couldn't give us one. There was no protocol for them to follow. So after speaking to many hospitals over the world, they decided they were going to do a bone marrow transplant. Darren then subsequently had 5 months of intensive chemotherapy again and more radiotherapy. Then he went on to have 12 days of what they call conditioning, where they strip out the bone marrow and they put somebody else's bone marrow inside. Unfortunately, the first two from a donor, they both failed due to unforeseen circumstances. But thankfully, they had a bag of his own cells back. But obviously, those cells were what were harbouring his two cancers in the first place. So we didn't really want them to have them back, but we had no choice. Now, thankfully, they took enough. So they gave him a third transplant with his own cells. And unfortunately, that failed, again, through circumstances they'd never seen before. So he had some further chemotherapy, and then he had his last bag of his own cells given back in October 2013, and he was 13 at the time. 3 days later, he trapped his fingers down the side of his bed and picked up 2 catastrophic infections in his hand and 1 in his mouth. Now, they told us that nobody's ever engrafted with a bone marrow transplant after 50 days, and you usually see some functioning around 22 to 30 days. We got to day 46 and there was nothing in there. There was no sign of any functioning bone marrow whatsoever. And with the 3 catastrophic infections taking, every ounce of the immune system that he had, they decided that they were going to send him to a hospice. And we were told that we had to take him. Effectively, I likened it to a conscious life support machine. So he was aware and awake and very much involved in the decision to unplug him, so to speak. On questioning the doctors and just how long I was going to have left with him once I unplugged him, they said 3 days a week at most. So he made a decision to go to the hospice on day 46, and Darren hung around. He improved somewhat just by leaving the hospital environment, but around day 65 or around thereabouts, he started to get quite anxious because he wanted to go now. He'd had enough. And because he was still alive, I asked the hospital to do another bone marrow aspirate just to prove to me there was absolutely nothing in there. And the results came back, there was no activity whatsoever. It was just literally a case of waiting now. They started to up the morphine and they started to introduce sleeping tablets, neither of which Darren wanted. He'd made it very vocal in his end-of-life care plan that he wanted to be compos mentis. And we were finding that morphine wasn't doing that. So on day 70, we decided to administer a cannabis tincture that we had made probably a month beforehand, just to put in a vape pen, just to see if it would take the edge off the pain he was experiencing at the time. And in the vape pen, it wasn't strong enough. It gave him a slight warm feeling, but not enough to take away the edge. But at day 70, I decided he was so anxious. He was literally waking up and screaming in the night that he just wanted to die. He begged me to take him to Belgium at the time as well, because they just legalised euthanasia for children. He was suffering incredibly. So we decided, what have I got to lose? So we administered the tincture sublingually under his tongue, around about 5 ml. And within half an hour, the benefits, his demeanour changed. He relaxed. He was mellow. He wasn't anxious anymore. He was able to sleep. And actually, he was on a drug called cyclazine, and he became incredibly addicted to this drug. And he'd been addicted to that for probably about 9 months, I believe, beforehand. And that evening, they brought him his cyclazine, and I immediately panicked, thinking, I've just given him cannabis, and what if this has, contraindications with this drug? And for the first time in 9 months, Darren actually turned around and said, I don't want it, you can take it away. And that was just the first evening. So to me, I saw it straight away as an exit drug. It had got him off this drug that he was incredibly addicted to. It helped with his anxiety, it was helping him, with his sleep issues. So I continued to give it because it was working. And then a few days later, we were just sat around in the lounge one day, and the catastrophic infection that he had in his hand, his fingers were actually necrotic, and they surgically debrided a lot of the skin, and they told us that underneath these bandages they could only be changed under surgical procedure, so we weren't allowed to look at them. And on day 75, a bandage came off his finger, and his finger looked just like mine, but it had no fingernail. It was very pink. And the hospital automatically didn't know what to do, because apparently you can't even produce skin cells without a functioning bone marrow. So the doctors all came running in and wanted to do blood tests and things like that, which I said, well, there's literally no point, because a week ago or so you told me there was nothing in there. And the blood results came back that evening that his white count had gone up in the 5 days that I'd been given the tincture. So I immediately presumed it was a coincidence. I saw what it did to him, but I didn't, in my wildest dreams, imagine it would do that. So I decided that I was going to allow him to keep taking it for a couple more weeks, and then I started to take it away and see what effect it had on his white count. And when I didn't give it, his white count dropped, and when I did administer it, his white count doubled. So I saw a direct correlation with the administered of this cannabis tincture and his immune system. So to me, that was fairly evident that it was having a beneficial effect on him. I didn't tell anybody at the time because I was absolutely terrified I was going to lose my children. Not only was I terrified Darren was going to die, but I was terrified that I was going to lose my younger son as well to social services if they found out what I'd done. But subsequently after that, Darren actually got worse when he didn't die, and he officially engrafted on day 104. Actually, he officially made his own blood cells on that day, and Darren found it incredibly difficult to deal with the fact that he wasn't dying, and so he tried to starve himself to death. And for 6 months, he refused point blank to eat. At the point, he got down to 26 kilos at his lowest. And he was diagnosed at 10 at 36 kilos. So as a 14-year-old boy, he was incredibly thin. And he was just refusing point blank to eat. And the hospital, all they could offer him was sectioning, force feeding and sedation. They didn't offer him any mental health care. They couldn't offer him anything else. So we decided to go to Spain. We just wanted to go on holiday. But we had been involved with some of the cannabis clubs. So they told us to speak to a man called Jeff Ditchfield. So we met up with him in Spain. Just all we wanted to do was shake his hand and thank him for everything he does. And that's when he then gave us a very small syringe of actual cannabis oil, to which we started giving it to Darren every day while we were in Spain. And for 12 days, he ate for 12 hours every single day. And actually on the first day that we gave it to him, after about an hour in the morning, both my husband and I were sat in the kitchen and we were getting some lunch together, and Darren shouted up from the swimming pool, "Can you make me loads? I'm absolutely starving." And those very simple words, but both myself and my husband looked at one another and burst into tears, because it's words that we'd begged to hear for such a long time. And so we just kept feeding him, and we actually went back afterwards, and his consultant saw him, and he'd put on 4 kilos. He no longer wanted to die, and his mental health had completely turned around, so much so that the hospital discharged him, decided they didn't need to see him anymore, and the rest is kind of history.
Wow.